One of the experiences that I think many rabbis have, but I know I had it especially when I was working as a rabbi of a shul, I had a pulpit, is that someone in the community dies and the family sits Shiva. The family is an observant family. But in every family there are many members who are not observant and often who are just not knowledgeable at all about Jewish customs and Jewish practices. And they too are part of the Shiva. They may be Avelim themselves halachically, brothers, uncles, children, grandchildren. And they all come together, the observant members of the family and the non-observant and not knowledgeable in Jewish matters. And as the rabbi of the people who want to keep the laws of the Torah and all the Minhagei Yisrael, so the rabbi is faced with a challenge. How do you introduce to people who do not know the proper protocol for sitting Shiva, how do you introduce them to the proper protocol? Especially since the custom has evolved in the Jewish world, which has no religious basis, that the Shiva is almost like a party. A lot of food is served, people are sitting around and talking idle talk, sometimes jokes, etc. And it certainly is not appropriate. And it's the rabbi's role to somehow explain in a very polite and courteous way to the people that the family whose home we're in are an observant family and they want to keep the Jewish custom in the way that it was traditionally and the way it should be. And sometimes very difficult because people don't want to hear the rabbi come and tell them what to do. And this is something in our family. Whenever someone dies, we always break out the best whiskey and we have special platters of food and we talk about the good old days, etc. So the rabbi has to be very tactful and diplomatic and appropriate. Derech Eretz has to explain to the people what the proper way is. I've done that many, many times in my career. Almost without exception. After a first day or two go by, when the people are still uncomfortable with all this different approach, they come over to me and say, you know, Rabbi, your way is the right way. It's much more appropriate to do things in the customary way that you've taught us. And I say, look, it's not my idea. Our rabbis from the Talmud and throughout the ages have taught us the way to do it. And they say, those rabbis knew what they were talking about. They understood human psychology, they understood, and you hear this from people who, to say the least, didn't respect rabbis a few days ago. But when they see the wisdom of our Torah and our Chazal and our customs, they're impressed that not only is this religiously the appropriate thing to do, but from a humane point of view, this is the proper way to say farewell to the person who's departed, and the proper way to begin the cycle of mourning. What are some of the things that I found myself teaching people who were ignorant of how to keep Shiva, how to comfort others, what to say, what not to say? Well, it shouldn't be thought that it's only Jews who are not knowledgeable about our religion that have a misconception about what Shiva is all about. Even Jews who were raised in a Frum environment, who received a proper religious education, who even received an advanced Jewish education, sometimes are unaware of what a Nichum Avelim is supposed to be like, what the experience is supposed to be like at the Beis Ovel, at the so-called Shiva house, what should be said, what should not be said, etc. Of course, there are halachos about this, halachos that are in the Shulchan Aruch, not in some footnote somewhere, but that are explicitly spelled out and that are based in many cases upon Mamorei Chazal, upon Gemaras. I'd like to speak about some of them. It's not going to be a lecture and all the halachos, but some of them that are especially important, perhaps from a interpersonal point of view, from the point of view of the emotional situation in which a person in mourning, an avel or an avela, finds himself or herself. So first of all, I want to point out that Nichum avelim, to comfort the mourner, is a mitzvah. There are Rishonim who feel that it's a mitzvah sasei doiraisa, that it's a mitzvah sasei min haTorah. We find that the Ribono Shel Olam blessed Yitzchak after Avraham died. And there's the Rabbeinu Yonah, Maseches Brochos, that says that that is the source, min haTorah, of the Hanhaga, the practice of Nichum avelim. The Rambam feels it's the Rabbonon. One way or the other, it's a very, very important mitzvah. And it's one of the ways that we have of fulfilling what Rabbi Akiva calls the Klal Gadol BaTorah, the great rule of the Torah, which is V'yahavta l'reacha kamocha. You should love your fellow as you love yourself. Now, how do you do that? So the Rambam explains there are various ways to do it. And one way is that when the person is in mourning, and of course, if you were in mourning, you would want to be consoled. You would want someone to come and make you better able to cope, better able to deal with the loss that you suffered. So too, you have a mitzvah of V'yahavta l'reacha kamocha, of expressing your love for your fellow Jew by going to him or to her and expressing how badly you feel, how much you're with him, to put his loss in perspective, if you can do that, to assign to it the proper religious, spiritual significance, or simply to be there. Just being there is also a way of making the person feel better. Feel he's not alone, he's supported, his friends, his family, his community are with him. These are all ways that we can fulfill the mitzvah of V'yahavta l'reacha kamocha. And that's extremely important. One of the things that we find as our communities have, Baruch Hashem, grown and become larger and larger, is that often we feel it's almost a chore. I have to go be Menachem over someone. I have to go and do it. And you take it upon yourself as a chore. Another job to do. And you have a list. Okay, today I have to have a 9 o'clock appointment, 9:30 appointment, 10 o'clock I have to be, quote, pay a Shiva call. And it becomes a chore, it becomes onerous, burdensome, becomes an ol. A mitzvah is not supposed to be that way. The Nevi'im, Yeshaya Navi, decries mitzvahs anoshim ulumoda. He decries a practice that sometimes a mitzvah becomes a habit. It's routine. You wake up in the morning, you put on your tefillin. A mitzvah is supposed to be something much more than that. It's supposed to have a certain degree of seriousness, of kovod rosh, of consciousness, of awareness of what you're doing. Whether it's halachic kavona or just being aware that you're doing something extremely important, something which is a fulfillment of V'yahavta l'reacha kamocha. This is something very, very powerful. Before I go into any specifics, just being aware that you're doing something which is so very, very important, such a mitzvah, such a tremendous mitzvah, is itself puts you in the proper frame of mind. Chazal say, we're taught that if a person has a choice between Nichum avelim and Bikur cholim, you have 20 minutes, and your choice is to go to the hospital to visit someone who's sick, or to go to a house of mourning to console someone who's in mourning. So Nichum avelim takes priority. The reason being, because when you do the mitzvah of Nichum avelim, you're doing something for the deceased, for the mace, for the person who died. You're doing something by honoring his family and honoring his own memory by showing up at the Beis Ovel. And you're doing something for a person who's alive, namely the mourner. Bikur cholim is only for the chola, only for the sick person who is alive. So Nichum avelim in the scale of things is very, very high up. Just being aware of this is extremely important and puts you in the right frame of mind. Let's go one step further. You come to the Beis Ovel. You come to the house of mourning. And you're confronted with somebody who's sitting in a lower chair or on the floor and who just lost a father, a mother, a sister, a brother, chas v'sholom, a child. And obviously the person is distraught. The person has suffered a great loss. And you're there to be menachem him, to somehow comfort him. What do? Almost everyone I've met and discussed this with tells me, I feel uncomfortable. I don't know what to say. And that's natural. That's very natural. Many times I've had the experience of accompanying a great Rav, a great Rosh Shiva, a great Rebbe in a couple of cases, to a Beis Ovel. And in so many of those instances, I remember leaving, how the person would say to me, this was difficult. This was very hard. It's always hard to find the right thing to say. And I wonder, here's a person who's a great Talmid Chacham, who has so much experience in so many areas of Jewish practice. Why does he find this so difficult? I once had this experience with a great Rosh Yeshiva, a Rav. His name was Rav David Kviat, who passed away some years ago. He wrote beautiful Sforim. He was still from the old school. He was a European Rav. And he was a Rav in Borough Park in the Agudas Yisrael on 18th Avenue. And we were at a Beis Ovel, and leaving, he expressed to me how difficult this was. So I asked him the question. We had a certain relationship, but I felt comfortable enough asking him, the Rav had so much experience with these kinds of things. You still find it so difficult? So he told me, and of course he spoke a Litvish Yiddish, but he knew English fairly well. So he said to me, he looked at me and he said, and I'll explain it to you. The problem is also English, not Yiddish really. The problem is, as jeder Mensch is different. Every person is different. You can't have a stock phrase, and it goes for everything. There are many mitzvahs, Baruch Hashem, you know exactly what to do. You follow the prescription, you say the Prach B'Brocha, and mitzvah is done. But when you're dealing with people, he explained to me, there's never one way to do it. Bikkur Cholim for one person, it requires one approach. Bikkur Cholim for another person requires a different approach. The same thing is true with Nichum Avelim. Everyone reacts to loss differently. And there are different types of losses. There's a loss of a parent, which is one thing. There's a loss of a child, which is a different thing. There's a loss of an old person. There's a loss of a young person. There's a loss of someone with whom you had a wonderful relationship with. And sometimes there's a loss of people, what you didn't have such a great relationship with. Sometimes you come to a family where two brothers did not get along so well all their lives, and one passed away, and you're menachem the other one. What do you say? What don't you say? It becomes very delicate, and you have to be very careful. It takes a lot of thought and a lot of siyata d'shmaya to say the right thing, to do the right thing. This was something extremely important that Rav Kviat taught me. People are different, and therefore they have to be approached differently. Some of the halachos help with just this problem of dealing with different people in different ways. There's one halacha that is almost the key to everything, and that halacha is, and it's based upon a Gemara in Moed Katan, that when you're menachem ovel someone, you don't start talking until the ovel starts talking. The mourner has to start the conversation. Sometimes, by the way, the mourner will say nothing. He'll just sit there, he's either so distraught or just Bechlal doesn't know what to say. And you're sitting there and he doesn't say anything, what do? And the natural temptation is, no one likes to sit there and not make conversation, so you think of something to start the conversation. Sometimes that's appropriate, but you have to be careful because halacha is wait for him. I saw recorded in the name of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach that in such a situation, you say nothing, you wait a respectable amount of time, and then you say, Hamokim Nachem Eschem, you say the formula, may God comfort you together with all the mourners of Tzion v'Yerushalayim, and you leave. Because if the mourner said nothing, maybe the best thing is, Sometimes the best thing is silence. Just, I'm here, I'm with you, don't say anything and go. But most times the mourner does say something, and that gives you a clue as to what your next step is. By the way, in general, this goes way beyond just Nichum Avelim. But when you're dealing with people, one of the things I learned long ago, you can't go wrong if you just listen. Right? You can't go wrong. If you say something, you might say the right thing, you might say the wrong thing. But if you just simply listen, then it's extremely appropriate. The person feels he's being heard. There is a concept in the secular world, but it makes good sense in every world, of active listening. Active listening means you don't only listen with your ear and shake your head, although that's fine too, but you say something which is really telling the person, I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. I know what you're saying. So when the person says, this is a terrible loss, and you say, it must be really a terrible loss. You had such a wonderful wife, and she's not here anymore. It's a terrible loss. You're not telling him anything he doesn't know, but you're reflecting his feelings. And then he can go on to the next step and tell you specifically what he's feeling, why he's feeling this way, etc. But the key is, take your cue from what the Ovel says. And if he opens up on a certain tone, then you know pretty much what your next reaction should be. Listen, say a little bit more than what he said, and take your cue from the Ovel himself. This is an extremely important guideline. And this is a halacha in Shulchan Aruch. There's another halacha in Shulchan Aruch which is interesting, and that is when the Ovel gives you a signal, which could be just a nod of his head, but the signal is enough, time to go, you go. People think that, many areas of halacha, kol hamar beharezeh meshubach, the more, the better. In certain areas of Torah, that's true. Sipo Yetzias Mitzrayim, by the Leil Seder, the more, the better. And of course, Talmud Torah, the more, the better. In many other areas of Tzedakah, the more, the better, although there too, there are limits. But when it comes to Nichum Avelim, it's not always true, the more, the better. Sometimes the less, the better. And more becomes a burden for the Ovel. He is embarrassed, he's tired, he's whatever, distracted. There are other people in the room. Learning that it's time to go. That's a very, very important halacha and a very, very important thing to do. There's no mitzvah of kol hamarba. Very often when I teach or speak about different aspects of the Torah, so I think back, when was the first time in my life that I experienced this particular mitzvah, this particular situation? So I think back, I remember the first time I put on tefillin, a month or so before it was bar mitzvah. I remember it like it was today. I remember long before that, when I was 4 or 5 years old, the first time I remember sitting in a sukkah with my grandparents. So I remember these things. So I've often thought, what was the first time I remember? In this case, it wasn't really sitting Shiva, but it was dealing with death and with the reaction to death by an Ovel. Not exactly halachically an Ovel, but in some sense an Ovel. And let me tell you this story. I had an aunt and uncle who are both since gone, who had several children, choshever children. They had 3 children. 2 of them are still alive today and well, Baruch Hashem, being Marbet's Torah, Yidden, wonderful Yidden. One of them, and his name was Simcha, died as a very young child, 2 or 3 years old, with a sudden death. If I'm not mistaken, it was what they call a crib death. Used to call a crib death, where the baby goes to sleep and he's in the crib, and then the next morning the baby never is gone, and not sure what happened. Nowadays maybe they do know what happened, but then this is a long time ago, about 60 years ago, a little more. and Simcha Nebuch died. And I remember they lived in a distant city from where we lived, but we found out about it. And my parents were upset, of course, and obviously the parents of the baby were upset. This is my father's brother, who was the father of the baby. And one of the things I decided to do was not to tell my Zayda, who was obviously the Zayda of this baby as well. The baby was my cousin. I decided not to tell him. He's an old man, he's going to hear this, he's going to get upset, it's going to be so difficult. So I didn't tell him until some time later. I no longer remember exactly how long later, but probably several months later. My Zayda came to visit us in our home, my parents' home. I was not yet bar mitzvah, 12-ish, something like that. And they told my Zayda. Now my Zayda was a Yid from the old school, a Hasidish Yid who learned Yoimam V'layla Mamish. He learned day and night, a big Talmud Chacham, a very, very special Jew, who was old and sick, but it was very interesting. When he heard the news that his grandchild had died, he, of course, was upset. And of course, his immediate response was burst out crying. But he took it better than everyone else, because he was able to put it in a certain perspective of hashkafa that I certainly didn't have, and neither did my parents. And I remember the day that they broke him the news, so we sat and talked about it, and he got on the telephone with my uncle and aunt in a distant city and spoke to them. And then he called me into a room. He wanted to talk just to me. And that experience was my first experience, in a sense, with Nichum Avelim, because of something he taught me. And this is what he told me. He said, you were in the room, he called me by my pet name, Hersh. My name is Tzvi Hersh, he called me Hersh. He said, you were in the room when we were talking about this. And you remember what everyone was saying. Everyone was saying, oh, did they do everything they could have done? Did they call the right doctor? Did they, and they said, well, they tried everything, they did everything, etc. He took out, not a Shulchan Aruch, but a Rav Yaakov Emden Siddur, where there are the halachas related to Avelos. But this is a halacha in the Shulchan Aruch too, I later found out. And the halacha is that you shouldn't be saying things like that. You shouldn't say, Malachol Asos, what can you do? The reason is, well, you shouldn't even say, oh, it's what happened, you can't change it. You shouldn't say things like that. Why? Because that implies that if you could change it, you would change it. And our reaction has to be, not everyone is able to have this reaction, but our reaction has to be, Tziduk Hadin, Hasur Tomim Pa'olo. This was God's will, and it happened. And to say words that imply, oh, if we could have changed it, if we could have done this in time and done that in time, and the right medicine and the right doctor and the right procedure, if we could have changed it, that approach is a wrong approach. Obviously, when the person is alive, you have to try everything you can possibly do. The best doctors and the best procedures and emergencies and everything, of course. But once there's nothing more to do, then your attitude has to be, and it's difficult many times to have this attitude, but Frum Yid has to try to have this attitude. This was the Ratzon of Ribono Shel Olam. God wanted it this way, and I accept it. Again, I stress, it's tough to do that. Not everybody can do that. Sometimes we feel angry at Ribono Shel Olam, and why did this happen to happen, and why me, and etc. And those feelings are understandable. But a Jew, a believing Jew, believes that God runs a perfect world. And even though many times we don't like the perfect world that we have, and we think we could do better, but we have to say to ourselves, no, this is what Tziduk Hadin is. I accept it. Hashem lo san, Hashem lo kach. God gave and God took. That's what we have to work toward. And therefore we have to avoid the kind of conversation that says, we could have changed it somehow. Once it's done, once it's the end, and the God is the Dayan Emes, God is the true judge. It's very important. And when I think about it, this was really the first lesson I learned from Isaiah of Hashalom about Avelus and things to say and things not to say. I'd like to share with you something. There's a sefer, which has been translated into English as well, on mourning. There are many, many books about Avelus, and some are better than others. Some are excellent on halacha, but don't really help in practical situations. Some tell you a lot about practical situations, but don't tell you about the halacha. This is one sefer that I personally use a lot. I'm not saying it's good for everybody, but it helps me in my rabbinical work and in my personal avelus that I've had over the years, losing both parents. It's called Pnei Baruch. In Pnei Baruch, there's a chapter on Nichum Avelim, which tells you some of the laws and rules about Nichum Avelim, some which I won't even mention here. What do you do about Nichum Avelim on Shabbos? What do you say? What do you not say? What do you do if you meet an Avel after the Shiva? You meet him 2-3 weeks later, or 6 months later, or 5 years later, what do you say? These are all important areas which are covered in this sefer, and it's other seforim like this. But what I want to bring to your attention is a document, a precious document, that's to be found in this sefer, and I'm sure it's to be found other places too. It's a letter that was written by one of the greatest Gedolei Yisrael of all time, but certainly of his time, of the 18th century, in the 1700s, whose name was Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, who's known popularly as the Rabbi Yonasan. The Rabbi Yonasan wrote powerful, masterful halachic works, Choshe Mishpat, Urim V'Tumim, and Yeredeya, Kreisi Uplesi, powerful works. And he also wrote many works on Drush and Machshava, Yaros Tavash. We're talking about one of the great Gedolei Yisrael, who's buried. I had the privilege of visiting his grave. He's buried in Hamburg, Germany. He was a Rav at the end of his life in a community known as Ahu, Aleph, Hey, Vov, Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek. These were once 3 cities. Now you go to Germany, it's 1 city, Hamburg, with 2 suburbs. In any case, he's buried there, and his matzeva stands. Even after the Shoah, his matzeva was not touched somehow. In any case, he wrote a letter, which we have a copy of the letter. Now, he wrote the letter in what's called jargon. Jargon is jargon, J-A-R-G-O-N, which means in Yiddish, kind of a German Yiddish. The letter was translated into Hebrew, and we have a copy of this letter here. And it's a letter he wrote to his sister-in-law. When you read the letter, you realize how she was his sister-in-law. The man who died was his brother-in-law, meaning his wife's brother. So this was his wife's brother's wife, sister-in-law in that sense. His wife's brother died. In Hebrew, the word for brother-in-law is gis, gimel yud sama. So he writes, I'm writing this, liachar petiras gisi ho'avrech, after the death of my brother-in-law, the young man, and I'm writing it to this sister-in-law, who, you see the relationship. This is not Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz's sister, and neither is it his wife's sister. It's his wife's brother's wife. So the relationship is not a close one necessarily, certainly not a blood relationship. But he writes to her, Divrei Nechama. It's a long letter, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I recommend it to everyone who's interested in such matters, because it shows you how a Gadol B'Yisrael writes to another person who's a woman, who's not directly closely related to him. And she, by the way, is the mother of several Yisomim. The young man who passed away left over several orphans, we don't know how many. And he writes this letter to her. At first he apologizes to her why he can't come to see her in person. This was 250, 300 years ago now. And you couldn't just take a plane and hop from one place to the other. So he apologizes for not being there in person. But he says to her, I want you to know that this past Zion Adar, which was the yard site of Moshe Rabbeinu, when I, of course, gave a hesped for Moshe Rabbeinu, I also included in my hesped words of eulogy for your late husband, Olav HaShalom. Oh, this sounds to us, big deal. But right there, it's so powerful. He's apologizing for not being there in person. That says a lot. That's so important in Hilchos Derech Eretz and how to get along with another person. I'm sorry, sister-in-law, I couldn't be there in person. It's too far. But I want you to know something that I did do. Something that obviously would make her feel wonderful. My brother-in-law, who's the Rav, I think at that point he was the Rav in a different city. No matter, who's a big Rav, in front of the public. When he spoke about Moshe Rabbeinu, he also spoke about my husband, Olav HaShalom. You know what that opening lines must have made her feel in terms of Nichum? It made her feel important. Her loss is important. A great Rav who happens to be her brother-in-law recognized the importance. Other people who she never met, never will meet, heard about her loss and her wonderful husband who died. This is so encouraging to her. I mean, even if there was nothing more than that, there would already have been for her some nechama, some consolation. And he goes on to say many things. First of all, he tells her, you're leaving over, you have now the job, the task of raising orphans. And you wonder, how am I going to be successful raising these orphans? I want you to know, and this is what he writes, Rov hanaorim hamatzlichim b'torah v'chochma v'yira umasa umaton hem yisomim. Powerful. Most of the young people who are successful in Torah, in chochma, in wisdom, in yira, in frumkeit, umasa umaton, and in business, are yisomim. Yisomim, orphans, as he goes on to say, have a special hatzlocha in life. He goes on to say why. But first of all, he's telling God, don't worry about your children. You're thinking now, how am I going to pay tuition? How am I going to raise children without a husband? Who's going to teach them? Who's going to do the homework with them? Who's going to learn Mishnayos with them? How am I going to do this? How will they possibly be successful? How will they ever have a panosa? I'm a poor woman, a widow, etc. And you're worried about all these things now? Let me tell you something. I'm a man of experience, he tells her. I know the best boy in the yeshiva, the best boy in the school, the best businessman, and the most frum yid, they're Yisomim. They all grew up as Yisomim, a special thing. Then he goes, which is very comforting to her, on a very practical level. You're not talking, in the luft, and you're not talking about philosophy. This is the woman's worries. That's what she's worried about now. Who's going to make these children into mention? And he tells her, don't worry. My experience tells me they'll be fine, they'll be wonderful, they'll be better than others. Tremendous nechama. But then he says why, and this brings me to tears just for sitting here. Because they lost a father who was a basar v'adam. They lost a father who was a human being, a mere mortal, flesh and blood. Now, God is their father. Because God is the Avi Yisoimim V'dayan Almanos. God is called the father of orphans. So God's their father. And he'll see to it that they have Torah and Chochmah and Yira and Masamat and Panosa. They have a father. Don't think they don't have a father. I saw a phrase in the writings of Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher, who was the Mashgiach Ruchni in the Slabodka Yeshiva in Slabodka in Eretz Yisrael, eventually. He says a powerful thing, that when we say the phrase, Yisomim Hoyinu, that the Ein Av, we are orphans and there's no father, he says that phrase is incorrect. It's wrong to say that phrase. He goes on to say that very often we say nowadays, our generation is a dor yosom. Is a dor yosom. It's an orphan generation. There's no great leaders, it's an orphan generation. Rav Sher says no, he doesn't say it's apikursus to say this, but he said it's wrong to say it. Because the Pasuk says in the Haftorah we read on Shabbos Shuvah, Ki b'cho yirucham yosom. You have to understand, you Jewish person have to understand that the Ribono Shel Olam recognizes and shows compassion to the orphan. The orphan is not an orphan. The orphan is not abandoned. The Ribbon Shalom is B'cha, in you, Ribbon Shalom, Yerucham Yosom. The Yosom always has a father. So if it's a Yosom Nebuch, a poor child who lost his father, like this young woman, this sister-in-law of Yonis Naibshitz, or if it's we who feel that we're an orphan generation, Chas v'Shalom, we're not an orphan generation, and this woman's children are not orphans totally, because they have a father. Their father is Ribbon Shalom. And this is part of a Nichum that Rabbi Yonason Eibshitz gave to his sister-in-law. I'm giving you this as an example of how one person, speaking to one desperate woman at a great physical distance, geographic distance, was able to deliver to her words, and some of these words we can use in our own contexts, words of great Nichum, words which would be very powerful to her. There's more here. But one of the things that he emphasizes, I first realized this from learning this particular letter, but as I've gotten more and more experience, I found out just how important this is. He says to her, not only to her, but to the children. I don't know how old these children were, but obviously the mother, when she got this letter, would read it to the children. So he writes, there are goyim who, when they suffer a loss like you suffered, committed suicide. Kvar hayu miyamim kedumim harbe goyim she'ibdu atzmam ladas b'chashvam latseis meha'olam hachashuch ulahagia el olam shekulo or. He says there are goyim who make a mistake and they think, this is so terrible a loss. Why do I have to stay in this dark world? I'll kill myself and I'll enter into the world of light, the next world. This is, as he puts it in our language, this is not the Jewish way. The Jewish way is not to do that. Chas v'sholom. And I was wondering, and I first saw this paragraph, wow, that's pretty strong words, talk about suicide. Now obviously there are Avelim who are thinking those kind of thoughts, but we hesitate to mention it to them, and I'm not recommending that we do. But he goes on, and what he's going to say next, I think we can say many times. He says to her, there are many ways of committing suicide. I'm going to give him examples in our world. You can jump off a bridge. There's another way of committing suicide, which is much longer, slower, but it's also a kind of suicide. We would call it self-destructive behavior. And that is, you don't take care of yourself, you don't exercise, you don't eat properly, you let yourself go. Be careful, he says to his sister-in-law. Al kain, achos v'hayeladim. Now my dear sister, it's not really his sister, but he's calling her his sister, and my dear kinderlach, my dear children. Hashgichu al briyuschem. Be careful about your health. Take care of your health. There's a natural tendency. My world is lost. My husband is gone. I'm not going to take care of myself. I'm not going to eat properly. I'm going to eat what makes me feel better. What makes you feel better is a lot of carbs and a lot of sugar. That's not going to help you. A good piece of cake with icing and everything else is going to make you feel better. Actually, physiologically, it stimulates the brain, the pleasure centers of the brain, and it makes you feel better when you're in mourning. But it also is not very good for you. So hashgichu al briyaschem, take care of your health. Take care of your health. And we would say nowadays, watch your nutrition, exercise, go for a walk, whatever it takes. You and the children, because you have to stay healthy. Because our attitude is not like those goyim. We don't want to jump away from this olam hachashuch, from this dark world. We want to stay in this world and make it lighter. And to do that, we have to be healthy. We have to do what they call nowadays self-care. You have to take care of yourself. And the tendency is when you're in mourning, you say, the heck with everything, I'm letting everything go. You can't let yourself go. And then he says something this is a psak from Rabbi Yonason Eibshitz. Zehu yoser chashuv mima sherak tomru kaddish avur avichem zal. Your health is more important, he's telling his little children, than saying Kaddish. There are going to be people in the shul, you're a 6-year-old, 8-year-old, there are going to be people in the shul who are going to say, come, say Kaddish, come, say Kaddish. That's important, but it's not important as your health. He doesn't fill in the blanks, but I can fill in the blanks. In our world, the child needs his sleep. The minyan is 6 a.m. The child is 7 years old, he has to go to school. Maybe it's more important that he sleep another hour than he goes to say Kaddish. That's what he's telling us. Quote, Zehu yoser chashuv mimashe rak tomru Kaddish avur avichem. Kizos hi mitzvah yoser gedola. It's a bigger mitzvah. Shetashkichu al briuschem. It's a bigger mitzvah to take care of your health. Utekablu hakol me'akadosh baruch hu b'yavo b'chiba. Take everything that God gives you with love. V'zen iskabel miyod l'rotznes HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This was something HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants you to be healthy. And that takes priority over many things that people think are more important. He's not saying they shouldn't say Kaddish, but these are children. Who knows what they're going through and everything. Sometimes you have to suspend certain things in the interest of their mental health or physical health. And this is what he's telling his sister-in-law. He also tells them another something, which is useful, practical. And that is, what do we say? The formula is, the words that Chazal gave us are, Hamokom Yenachem Eschem et Ribbono Shalom, comfort you, B'soch She'or Avelei Tzion V'Yerushalayim, along with all the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, of Tzion and Yerushalayim. Rabbi Anderson says an interesting thing to his sister-in-law. He says, in my words, not in his words, you have to put everything into a certain perspective. You are an individual person who suffered an unspeakable loss. You're also part of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people are all almonos and all yisomim. In his words, V'hinenu kulonu yisomim v'almonos. We are all in Golus. We are a people who have suffered all sorts of losses, national losses, community losses, all kinds of losses. We are all part of that. And even this woman who now can't see beyond her own loss, but there's a part of her that's aware that she's part of a bigger picture of Klal Yisrael. And Klal Yisrael is in mourning, Al Tzion V'Yerushalayim. And somehow that lesson is also a Nichum. I'm not alone, I'm part of this bigger picture. It's bigger than just me. What do we say nowadays? It's not just all about you. Now you can't go to a woman who's crying Nebuch and say it's not just about you. But you can begin to give her a context. You're a person, but you're part of B'toch She'or Avela Yisrael. You're part of a bigger picture. You have to begin to give her that context in a way that's appropriate. And of course, when she's ready to hear it, or he's ready to hear it. He then goes on to tell an interesting story about a Gentile king. All right? Darius, Persian king. Melech Gadol Haya Uben Yochid. Darius was a great king, and he was an only child. And he died as a young man. Before he died, he called over his mother and his wife and said to them, I'm dying. I don't want you to cry until someone comes to you and tells you something bad about me. This is a chokhmah, wisdom of King Darius. Don't cry until someone comes and says, oh, your son, your husband, Darius, he was a terrible king. Then you could start crying. Now, of course, we understand this was a ploy. He didn't want them to be very upset. Of course, they were going to cry. But whenever they were crying, they would remember that their son or husband told them just before he died not to cry until someone said anything bad about him. And he could bet that no one was going to come to the queen or the queen mother and tell them, your son's a horrible fellow. So they would always feel the need to hold back those tears. That's a story that the Rabbi Anderson tells about King Darius. But then he makes it brings it back to a Torah perspective, not just King Darius, who definitely had a very wise strategy. And what he says is this: if your husband had, which he did have, a shem tov, a good reputation, he was a Talmud Chacham, he was a kosher Jew, he was an honest fellow, he had good friends, he was mu'uravim habrios, he was a popular fellow, then that is your biggest nechama. That there's nobody who's going to come to you and have a bad word to say about him. That's your nechama. Your nechama is in all the good things he accomplished in his life. And if you want to mourn, when someone comes and says, your husband was a crook, then you have to mourn. All right? Fascinating. The shem tov that a person leaves behind, of course, is his biggest Yerusha. That's what he leaves over. But it's also one of the biggest divrei nechama you can tell a person. He had a shem tov. Take nechama from his shem tov. Very, very important. He ends the letter with the following words: Al kain achos v'hayalodim. Again, the way he addresses them 3 times in the course of this letter: my sister and the children. Bozer rotzani l'sayim. Here's my conclusion. Chaye heyi in the feminine. Please be besimcha. Shehu niftar b'shem tov ubeli dofi. He died with a good reputation, with no faults. Ve'ezeu ben ha'olam haba shkol shekeneged zekenov kavod. Ben olam haba is someone who dies, and everyone can say, old, young alike can say he was a wonderful person. So therefore he concludes, Ubechein achos, my dear sister, Nichyeh betikva Hashem. Let's live together in the plural. Lo milem, nichyeh, betikva Hashem, with hope to God. V'kovei Hashem yachlifu koach, yalu evak nesharim. He wishes her the koach, the special strength and energy that the Rebbeinu Shalom gives to those people who have hope in Him, who have bitachon in Him. This letter to me, he writes, Mimeni Gischa, from me, your brother-in-law, Hakoton, Yehonason, Ben Arav, Nosanota, Chonepo, Mitz. He was then living in the city called Metz, M-E-T-Z. He was the Rav there before he became the Rav in Ahu. The footnote says, this letter was printed in a book called Gedulas Yehonason, Beloshon Jargon, in Yiddish German. V'turgam Lashon HaKodesh, and then he tells you who translated much more recently into Lashon Kodesh. This letter for me is a model of how a person can give divrei nechama and must give divrei nechama, and it sets up such a powerful example that I can think of no more powerful example. One of the subjects which somehow, in my experience, hardly ever gets brought up at a base ovel, but which should be, is the whole concept of an olam haba, the whole concept of another world. It's fascinating because sometimes people feel, I don't want to talk about philosophy at a base ovel. I want to talk about how did he die? Did he have pneumonia or did he have a cardiac arrest? That's neither here nor there. To talk about Tchias HaMeisim, that is the resurrection of the dead, to talk about Olam Haba, to talk about the next world, to talk about what the next world might be like. The tzaddikim sit with crowns on their heads, v'nenen miziv hashchina, and get pleasure from the radiance of God. Sometimes we think these things are, they're way up in the clouds. I can't talk to the Velim about that. And when I say to people when they tell me that is, you daven 3 times a day, or sometimes 4, sometimes 5 times a day. So what are you saying in the very second bracha? You have a whole bracha in Shemona Esrei, It's not a philosophy to be put in the animamens at the end of the davening. It's part of the davening you say every day. You can talk about that. How you talk about it, what words you use, depends upon the person. Like Rav Kviat says, that Yeder Mens is different. But that too has to be part of the conversation. And for that, there's a beautiful vort. It's more than a vort, it's a rayon, it's an idea, which is also in the same sefer. He quotes it in the name of Likutei Anshe Shem. And I'll conclude with this because this is very powerful. The pasuk says, "Boni matem l'Hashem Elokeichem." You all are sons, children of God. Lo siskodedu v'lo sasimu korcha b'nechem l'meis. You're not supposed to react to death of a close person by scratching yourself and tearing yourself and pulling out your hair and all these extreme things. This is an aveira in the Torah. Why shouldn't you have this extreme grief reaction? Why? Ki am kadosh ato Hashem Elokecha uvecha bochar Hashem lios lo liyam segula. Because you are such a special people, you shouldn't have that reaction. So this Likutei Anshe Shem brings, he's quoting someone, I'm not sure whom, but someone in the early Yisrael asked a question, powerful question. That should make us want to tear our hair out all the more. If you're nothing, you're an animal, you're a monkey, you're just one kind of a monkey, like evolutionists say, and another monkey dies, so what are you going to tear your hair out for? But if you're Bodem Atem Lashem Elokeichem, if you're a prince and the Rosh Hashanah is calling you his prince, so that's all the more reason when the prince dies to tear out your hair. After all, he gives a marshal. If I lose a diamond that's worth $1,000, so you're going to tell me, oh, that diamond, it really wasn't worth $1,000. It was worth $1 million. That's going to make me feel better? It's going to make me feel worse. So he says, no, you don't understand. Imagine a prince, Taka prince, like we all are princes. We're all Jewish people, are B'nai Malachim. We're all Jews, are princes and princesses. Suppose there's a king and he has a son, the prince, and he sends the prince to marry a queen in a distant, distant country. And the prince grows up in the other country and lives his life there, supported by his father-in-law, the king, who supports him with a beautiful palace and a royal coach and a crown and blah, blah, blah. And then the father says, okay, prince, my son, it's time to come home. So the prince is going to have to give up everything he had by his father-in-law, by the foreign prince, foreign king. But he's going to come home. He's going to come back to his father, where we'll have a bigger palace and more royal coaches and a chance to get the royal crown to become the king. So he doesn't mourn because he knows that where he's going is to an even better and higher place. This is what the pasuk is telling us, that don't mourn because you are a prince and you're going back to the palace. You're going back to your father, the king. From that aspect, when we realize that the person that we're mourning for, whoever he was or she was, however precious they were, but they're going back now to the father, they're going back to the ultimate palace, and therefore we have to mourn for them. But extreme mourning, no, that's wrong. Extreme mourning is wrong. The mourning has to be appropriate and measured. The Rambam tells us at a certain point where grief has to stop because we are ma'aminim, we are believers, and we believe that the person we lost is now in a better place, a different place, a higher place. He or she has gone back to her or his father.